Welcome to Debunking Leftist Myths, and today's topic that we're going to run into is why the left is wrong on guns. And as I start most of these, I want to introduce the idea that, again, that most of the time the way the left tries to present their arguments, they do it by taking something that means one thing in common parlance in everyday speech that me and you understand perfectly normal, and they try to twist it or are something that seems really close to it that is just in generally to warp the meaning of the words to make you're thinking about one thing and they're going to use another word or that same word to mean something else, or they're going to use a different word to mean what you're thinking about while sneaking something else in under the table. They're basically playing with the data and playing with the linguistics to mess with your head. And guns are definitely one of the big areas where the left is guilty of this. And the number one stat I would say that the left is guilty on this is that whenever you're looking at an article in the media, whenever you're looking at a study, a news report, something you see on TV, something you hear from a big website that you know isn't exactly even-handed, instead of using the term gun murder, they'll use the term gun death. And they'll use the two almost interchangeably. They'll talk about, say, Columbine, or they'll talk about a high-profile murder, and then immediately they'll turn around and quote a stat, but the number that they use will be gun death instead of gun murder. And here's the reason why. Over the number of murders with guns is dwarfed 2 to 1 by the number of suicides by gun. Basically, for every person who kills themselves with a gun, only half a person is murdered by a gun. Or a less awkward way to put that is, for every murder committed with a gun, 2 suicides are undertaken with a gun. Now, I understand if you're concerned about suicides because mental health is a big issue and should be addressed within this country, but when you're playing with those, it's just sort of obvious what you're doing. You're trying to show scenes of murders and then replace that number with a number that includes suicides, which is 3 times bigger than the number you would otherwise have to put out there. That's why they do that. And there's plenty of countries out there with very strict gun control, like Japan and South Korea, where the suicide rate is higher than the suicide rate in America. So even in countries where you have very strict gun control, you have absolutely no guarantee of achieving a lower suicide rate. There's not enough correlation between the two things to say if we have strict gun control, we're going to have a low suicide rate because of data points like that. People will find other ways to kill themselves if they make the decision to kill themselves. That's why the two issues, they have to be addressed separately. If you're going to try to address suicides, you're not going to be able to address it through gun control. And that's the number one thing you'll see is leftists trying to muddy the waters by throwing those two issues together when really they don't have anything to do with each other. People are going to find ways to off themselves if they want to off themselves. You have to address suicide, mental illness as their own issue. The other thing that leftists don't really want to do is they don't want to dive into the actual murder stats of who is doing the killing and who is being killed. Generally, they'll present this big headline number about the number of people that are being killed, but what sort of people are being killed by guns, and what sort of situations are they in? Well, when you do a little bit of digging, what you find is as many as 80% of the murder victims, not the murderers, the murder victims, 80% of the murder victims have a criminal record. And when you dig a little deeper, the percentage is there that large numbers of them are actually awaiting trial for pending criminal charges against them. So basically, the violence, the vast majority of the criminal violence that you see in the United States surrounding guns is limited to the sort of narrow criminal underworld. Most of the people who end up dying get tied up in some sort of scheme where they're involved with rival gangs, they're dealing drugs, they're going into dangerous places to buy drugs, they're servicing the underworld in some sort of way, they're connected to criminals and criminality to such a degree that when we look up the criminal history of the victims of murder, 80% of them have some sort of criminal record that shows that they are actively taking some sort of risk and dabbling in that underworld where you can't go to the cops. You know, if you're a big drug head, what are you going to do? Go say, hey, Mr. Drughead, I'm Mr. Drughead, and my drug dealer overcharged me. He took my money and he didn't give me the drugs. You can't go to the cops with that. You know, so the way the underworld solves its problems is with violence, because it can't go through the normal system. That's why so many of the actual murder victims aren't the little 5-year-old white girls that you see on TV. They're the members of the criminal underclass. They're the gangbangers and the hookers and the all sorts of nefarious people that are already part of this underworld, fall victim to it in the vast majority of cases. So you've already eliminated about 80% of your risk of being murdered. 80% of the murder problem is a violent criminal problem, a violent crime problem, and I would say I'd attach most of that right onto the war of drugs. If we could get some sort of end to the war on drugs, you know, make pot legal, decriminalize a lot of the hard stuff, get people in the treatment centers instead of rape factories, we would eliminate more murders that way than we would ever be able to eliminate through gun control. Moving on to the next idea here, there's a lot of hyper focus by the media, particularly on mass shootings, your Columbines, your jihadi nightclub shooting guy, your Newton, I can list them off, where a large number of people are killed in a single incident. But even when you take all of those incidents and add them together, they don't add up to a meaningful statistic at the end of the year. You might get, and the definition of what constitutes a mass shooting is a little difficult to establish a threshold. Whatever qualifies that, you can really mess with the stats by trying to mess with what is considered a mass shooting. But whenever 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 people get shot and there's a big body count, that's what leads the news. That's what gets to focus on. But at the end of the year, when you're actually tallying up, well, why did 8,000 people get murdered this year? The mass shooting numbers are going to constitute a tiny, tiny, tiny minority. out of your likelihood to be murdered, your likelihood of being a mass shooting victim is even a tiny fraction of that. You're far more likely to be killed by your drug dealer because you're late on your payments than you are to be a victim of a mass shooting. But mass shooting is what leads. Assault rifle is what is generally victimized, and it's just another one of those things where the numbers don't make sense. If you're going to worry about violent crime, if you're going to try to take the largest chunk out of that, what would you be focusing on? You wouldn't be focusing on mass shootings at all, because realistically, the things you would have to do to prevent mass shootings are real kind of tight security kind of measures that you would have to take at public venues. You'd have to have body searches and bag searches and metal detectors and that kind of thing in almost every public place. All the malls, all the big venues, all your sporting events, all your movie theaters. That's the level of security you would need to stop those kind of events, because you have them in gun control states. You have jihadis killing 150 people in France with AK-47s and grenade launchers. So gun control doesn't stop that. Going past that, I mean, you get this kind of weird leftist hypocrisy where they're going on all the time about how cops are violent racists. All cops are violent racists. But then they say, oh, and then only cops should have guns. How's that one add up? Yeah, I don't even know what to add on that one because it's just sort of crazy. And ultimately, this is a little bit of a generalization, but it rings true, especially when you look like a map of the United States and see which states contribute the most military personnel to armed forces, who has the most military experience. And it's almost never the liberal bastions. The lowest, your San Franciscos, your Bostons, your New Yorks, your Chicagos, people aren't rolling out of those places in large numbers to join the armed forces. They don't really have experience with guns. People who live in Chicago or New York aren't going out to the country on the weekends with their dad or their grandpa and taking target practice at the ranch. So these people that are anti-gun are generally not at all familiar with guns. They don't have a whole lot of experience. It's something that they aren't familiar with, they're uncomfortable with, and that they've been indoctrinated to be afraid of, to be fearful of. And it's kind of disingenuous because it's kind of like taking a person who already doesn't like football and then saying, well, football is this awful, dangerous, unnecessary thing, and we should ban it. Well, that person knows nothing about football. They lose absolutely nothing if they ban football. Firearms are not a part of their life. They're not aware enough on any sort of level to act on their own self-defense. They're way too passive of an individual to be able to act on their self-defense. So there's absolutely nothing for that sheepish kind of a person to support banning guns, because it's something that they've never even really had an opportunity to be exposed to. And by the time you get to these people, they're middle-aged people, and they're set in their ways, and they're living in some sort of ivory tower job, separated from the public. You're really not going to change that person's mind. And then you get on to kind of the second tier. One side of firearm use justification is for self-defense. And you'll always hear sort of misleading stats put out by the left where they'll say, hey, if you have a gun in your home, you're more likely to shoot yourself or a family member than you are to shoot a criminal. And the fundamental thing that is missing in that situation is the it's not the only if that the only way that argument would work is if the only way to stop a crime was be to kill someone with a gun. That's not how it works. When you get into the investigation of the studies about what they call defensive gun use or defensive firearm use, there's a big argument on the right and the left as to the number of defensive gun uses. But the vast majority of defensive gun uses is there's a crime taking place, there's an incident taking place. One person flashes the gun, and then the other person is like, whoa, that's not what I signed up for. And then the incident is immediately over, no matter what that person had intended previously. The cost benefit of their criminal activity, whatever it may have been, changes as soon as they're confronted by that person with a firearm. And that's another one of those statistics that you don't get told between, say, Europe and America. You're about twice as likely, 2 to 3 times more likely in Europe to be present at your robbery than you are in the United States. The sort of behavior that criminals in the United States, that robbers, burglars, whatever you want to call them, in the United States takes is completely different than what they do in Europe, where guns are banned. In Europe, they don't care if you're home. They'll come in with crowbars and bats and whatever, and these young punks will kneecap you, knock you out, do whatever they want to you, and take your stuff. That's called a hot burglary or home invasion. And they don't really record these stats, but the stat that they use is, are you present at the time you are robbed? In the United States, the criminals are sneaky. They want to attack you while you're gone, your home while you're gone. And so you're far less likely to be a victim of violent crime in the United States due to a robbery than you are in Europe. Because in Europe, they've basically criminalized self-defense. You can't act in your own self-defense. You know, they have a guy in jail in Britain that shot some obvious criminals, and then the criminals, sue him and put him in jail, which just makes absolutely no common sense whatsoever, that they become such cucks in these countries that they lock up the homeowner for shooting the criminals. And then really you get to this final separate category from self-defense and move on to, are guns useful for taking down a tyrannical government? And the first thing you'll hear right away is, oh my god, you fucking idiot. Do you think you, with your bumbling little rifle, are going to take on a powerful military with tanks and airplanes and drones and sophisticated military forces? Are you some kind of idiot that you think that would ever be possible? And these are the same people that have absolutely zero experience with guns, that have no military experience, that haven't been around guns, that don't really know anything about guns, haven't handled guns, don't have any confidence with them, but they're immediately willing to jump out there and say, hey, your gun is useless against the government in the event of some kind of tyrannical takeover by an authoritarian government. They say you're an idiot. Well, all the biggest slaughters in history have occurred when there's been an imbalance of power. So the more imbalanced you make the sides in any conflict, the bigger the slaughter is going to be. Because when something is easy, you make it more likely. So ask me this, is it easier or harder to take over a country with a tyrannical government if the population is armed? I mean, it's a real simple and easy question to answer. If you were the next Hitler or Stalin and you wanted to take over a country, would you rather have your opponents and the masses be armed or unarmed? It's really easy. You would want them unarmed. And then, really, another reason why they don't understand the kind of geopolitical power situation is they're not really honest about where guns would be important to defending yourself. The way I see it is that there's 3 countries in the world, 3 industrialized countries, where it would be useful and important for avoiding tyrannical rule for you to own a firearm. That's the United States, Russia, and China. Beyond that, all the rest of the industrialized world, whether or not you have a gun for holding off a tyrannical government, in the long term, I don't think it would benefit you at all. If you're in the UK or France or any of these other countries, at least right now, as the way the geopolitical situation in the world exists at this moment, there's no real reason for that it would help for you to have a gun. That would help for self-defense. But let me explain in a little bit more detail. If a European country, let's say a small to medium-ish, rich European country, went full Hitler or Stalin, went full authoritarian, started invading neighbors, started subjecting their people to authoritarian means, sending people to gulags and work camps, and that kind of awful stuff. The immediate response by the big military powers of the world, the Chinas, the Russias, and especially America, is they would lick their chops and they would say, looky here, a dummy authoritarian is doing war crimes and giving me an excuse to invade their country and chop them up into little pieces that I can govern and hand out to people. So there's no reason for, in this kind of middle ground that Europe inhabits, a kind of rich, medium to smallish country, a dictator is never going to take over your country because someone bigger is just immediately going to take them out. Now, if you're on the low side, if you're out in the third world in the boonies, then yeah, every house needs an AK-47 in it because the whole thing is basically run by warlords. So that's your 2 sides of your coin. It's important at the top, in America, China, Russia, and it's important at the bottom. But it's not important in the middle where, we don't go and invade every little country unless they have natural resources that we can exploit. Then we'll gladly invade them for whatever reason. Sad, but true. But on the high end, there's really no country, and here's where the difference is. There's really no country where you could be, if America went full Hitler or Stalin, or Russia went full Hitler or Stalin, or China went full Hitler or Stalin, the combination of their geographical isolation, the size of their populations, and the sophistication of their military means that no outside powers are reliably going to be able to militarily handle any of those situations in a profitable way. Yeah, theoretically, you might beat them at the end of a long, protracted struggle, but that long, protracted struggle isn't going to be profitable. If France or Belgium or Spain or the UK or Germany or any of these little European countries went to a dictatorship, not only could I invade those countries, I could invade those countries and turn a profit doing it. because I could say, obviously, you people are incapable of governing yourselves, so we're going to have to oversee it for a while before we can get your nation back on its feet. By the way, you're going to have to pay us some more reparations for taking out this horrible regime that took over your country. Even if I did that in Russia or China or America after taking out the horrible regime, the funds and the deaths and the manpower and the war industry that would have to go into securing those military victories, I would never be able to extract the resources necessary in order to make that a profitable engagement. So the reason why Europeans aren't enslaved right this moment, and the reason why civil liberties are hard to come by in Russia and China compared to the United States is nobody can waltz into those places in Russia and China with a military force and expect to make an easy go of it. And those people are largely disarmed in China and Russia compared to the state power. And so that's why guns are so important. And yes, I would say finally, if you're underestimating the value of the armed populace against a military power, and here's why. People generally those people that are unimaginable, they don't have a good imagination when it comes to the military. They're the first ones to tell you that your guns would be useless. They're imagining this kind of a Hollywood movie in the head where you're taking your small rifles and going up against big tanks and attack helicopters and things like that. That's not how a domestic guerrilla war is fought. In that sort of a situation, you would go after a soft target. What's a soft target? Well, a soft target is pipelines, refineries, war industries, fuel depots, railways, any kind of transportation ways. Can you blow up a ship in the harbor? You take the war machine and you undermine it you don't attack the sharp pointy end, you attack the soft squishy end while avoiding the pointy end. And when you're dealing with so many millions of people who look exactly like each other in the insurgency in a guerrilla force, who are also your tax base, the people you want to take over and control, you don't really have anywhere to point those tanks and those bombers. A B-2 bomber is useless in a street-to-street civil war. What are you going to do? Fly over the city and bomb it completely? Is that going to help you at all from a military standpoint? Where are you going to park your tanks? America has a few thousand tanks. There's 80 million gun owners in the United States. Where are you going to put your couple thousand tanks? And when you decide to put your couple thousand tanks, what if I just blow up the supply truck instead? The ammo truck. What happens when the guys inside get tired and they want to spend their pay on some hookers and some beer? I mean, what happens when the hookers have been paid off and those guys get their throats slit, while they're having a good night at the bar? That's a little bit of Sun Tzu there for you, as you strike where the enemy is weak, not where the enemy is strong. And, I'm not going to teach you how to fight a guerrilla war in one little message here, but that's generally how it goes, that the military might that you see on display in places like Iraq or even World War II, American war industry was never threatened. So if you have a domestic civil war where supply lines are sporadic, then yeah, you're a little armed militia that can pop out and ambush at any single time and take out your communication, your fuel, your supplies. That's of vital importance. And so I'm getting up to about half an hour on guns here. I hope you found these explanations to be helpful for you and enlightening. and we'll get you some more debunking of leftist myths in the future. Thank you. Have a good one.